Jack McLeod died a hero at Gallipoli, saving 12 men including his younger brother. Tommy McLeod lived, but sometimes he wondered if surviving was the harder fate. The guilt of living when your hero brother dies is a weight few can bear. It was February 15, 1916, when Private Thomas Tommy McLeod stepped off the hospital ship at Sydney Harbor. The Gallipoli campaign was over, the peninsula evacuated, and the survivors were finally coming home. Tommy should have felt relief, joy, gratitude. Instead, all he felt was the crushing weight of a question that had haunted him for 3 months. Why was he alive when Jack was dead? The crowd at the dock was cheering, families reuniting with their sons and husbands, but Tommy stood alone on the gangplank searching the faces for someone who would never be there. Jack should have been the one coming home. Jack, with his natural leadership, his courage under fire, his ability to make impossible decisions that saved lives. Jack was the hero, the one their mother had always been proud of, the one who deserved to survive. But Jack was buried on a hillside in Turkey, and Tommy was here carrying nothing but guilt and a letter he'd been too afraid to open. The letter had been found in Jack's personal effects after Hill 60, and what it contained would force Tommy to confront not just his brother's death, but the real reason he felt so unworthy of survival. Tommy had enlisted to follow his brother just like he'd followed Jack everywhere since they were children. Jack was 2 years older, stronger, smarter, braver. Everything Tommy wished he could be. When Jack had signed up for the army, Tommy had begged to go too, not out of patriotism or adventure, but because he couldn't imagine a world where he and Jack weren't together. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Tommy," Jack had said on the ship to Gallipoli. "You're my brother. That's enough." But it hadn't felt like enough. Not when Jack was promoted to sergeant while Tommy remained a private. Not when the other men looked to Jack for leadership while they barely noticed Tommy existed. Not when Jack made the hard decisions that kept them alive while Tommy just followed orders and tried not to get in the way. At Hill 60, Tommy had finally gotten his chance to prove himself. The mission was supposed to be reconnaissance, but intelligence had revealed Turkish artillery positions that threatened the entire ANZAC line. Someone had to take them out, and Jack had volunteered his squad for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. But what Tommy had done during that mission would haunt him more than his brother's death, and the letter in his pocket contained the proof of his cowardice. The attack had gone wrong from the start. The Turkish positions were more heavily defended than expected, and Jack's modified plan, splitting into 3 groups to create diversions, had worked too well. The enemy had concentrated their fire on Tommy's group, pinning them down in a shell crater while Jack and the others tried to reach the artillery positions. Tommy had been terrified. Not the normal fear that every soldier felt, but paralyzing, overwhelming terror that made him want to curl up in the bottom of that crater and never move again. He could hear Jack shouting orders, could see the other men advancing despite the machine gun fire, but Tommy couldn't make himself move. "Come on, Tommy," Jack had yelled across the battlefield. "We need you." But Tommy had stayed frozen in that crater, watching his brother and the other men fight their way toward the Turkish guns while he cowered in safety. It was only when he saw Jack fall, saw his brother's body crumple under enemy fire, that Tommy had finally found the courage to move. By then it was too late. Jack was dead along with 7 other men. The mission had succeeded. The Turkish artillery was destroyed. But the cost had been everything Tommy cared about. The letter Jack had written before the mission would reveal that his brother had known exactly what kind of man Tommy was, and had died trying to protect him anyway. Tommy had carried that letter for 3 months without opening it, afraid of what he might find inside. He knew it was addressed to him. He'd seen his name in Jack's familiar handwriting, but he couldn't bring himself to read words written by a hero to a coward. Now standing on the dock in Sydney with nowhere else to go, Tommy finally broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Jack's words hit him like a physical blow. "Dear Tommy, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and I didn't make it back. I want you to know that I'm not afraid to die, but I am afraid of leaving you alone. Not because you can't take care of yourself, you're stronger than you think, but because I know you'll blame yourself for my death." Tommy's hand shook as he continued reading. Jack had known. Somehow his brother had known exactly what would happen, exactly how Tommy would react. "I need you to understand something, Tommy. You didn't fail me at Hill 60. You did exactly what I hoped you would do. You survived. I saw you in that crater and I was glad you stayed there. Not because you were a coward, but because keeping you alive was more important to me than any mission." What Jack revealed next would shatter everything Tommy thought he knew about courage, cowardice, and the real reason his brother had died. "The truth is, Tommy, I changed the plan specifically to keep you safe. I put you in the group that would be pinned down knowing you'd have to take cover. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, so I made sure the most dangerous part of the mission fell to me and the others. You think you failed me, but you did exactly what I needed you to do. You lived." Tommy sank onto a wooden crate, the letter trembling in his hands. Jack hadn't died because Tommy was a coward. Jack had died because he deliberately put himself in harm's way to protect his younger brother. The guilt Tommy had been carrying wasn't justified. It was exactly what Jack had tried to prevent. But the letter wasn't finished. "I know you'll think this makes you weak, but you're wrong. It takes a different kind of courage to live with loss, to carry on when the people you love are gone. I'm asking you to be brave in a way I never had to be. I'm asking you to live." Jack's final request would challenge everything Tommy believed about heroism and force him to find a new kind of courage. "There's something else, Tommy. Sarah is pregnant. She doesn't know yet. I only found out in her last letter, which arrived the day before the mission. You're going to be an uncle, and that child is going to need someone to tell them about their father. Not the hero everyone else will remember, but the man who worried about his little brother, who made terrible jokes to keep morale up, who cried when he thought no one was looking." Tommy looked up from the letter, his vision blurred with tears. Sarah was pregnant. Jack was going to be a father, and now that child would grow up never knowing the man who had died to protect his family. "I need you to take care of them, Tommy. Not because you owe me anything, but because you're the only one who really knew me. Sarah will need someone who understands that heroes are just ordinary men who do what they have to do." And my child will need someone who can teach them that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear. The letter ended with words that would stay with Tommy for the rest of his life. You are not a coward, Tommy McLeod. You are my brother, and that makes you the bravest man I know. Live for both of us. But living for both of them would prove harder than Tommy could have imagined, and it would take a confrontation with the other survivors to show him what Jack's sacrifice really meant. Tommy found Sarah at the small house she and Jack had rented in Paddington. She was sitting in the garden, her hand resting on a belly that was just beginning to show, staring at a telegram that had arrived 3 months earlier. When she saw Tommy, her face crumpled with grief and relief. "Tommy," she whispered, "you came back." "I'm sorry, Sarah," Tommy said, the words feeling inadequate. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save him." Sarah looked at him with eyes that held no blame, only sadness. "He wrote to me about you, you know, in his last letter. He said you were the best man he knew and that if anything happened to him, I should look after you because you'd blame yourself for things that weren't your fault." Tommy showed her Jack's letter, and they sat together in the garden crying for the man they'd both loved, sharing memories of his terrible jokes and his fierce protectiveness. Sarah told Tommy about the baby, about her fears of raising a child alone, about her determination to make sure Jack's child knew their father had been a hero. "But not the kind of hero they'll put in the history books," she said. "The kind who worried about his men, who changed battle plans to keep his little brother safe, who wrote love letters that made me laugh even when I was scared." It was Sarah who would help Tommy understand that surviving wasn't a betrayal of Jack's memory, but the fulfillment of his brother's greatest wish. Over the following weeks, Tommy struggled to find his place in a world without Jack. He couldn't go back to the docks. The work reminded him too much of the life he and Jack had planned to build together. He couldn't face the other survivors from Hill 60, convinced they would see his cowardice written on his face. But Sarah wouldn't let him hide. She dragged him to the memorial service for the men who had died, forced him to stand with the other survivors as they honored their fallen mates. And it was there that Tommy learned the truth about what the other men thought of him. "Your brother saved my life," said Private Collins, one of the 5 men who had survived the mission. "But you know what he told me right before we went in? He said, 'Take care of Tommy if something happens to me. He's got more courage than he knows, but he'll need time to find it.'" Another survivor, Corporal Davies, nodded. "Jack was proud of you, mate. Said you were the reason he fought so hard, because he had something worth coming home to." Tommy stared at these men, expecting to see judgment or pity, but finding only respect and understanding. They didn't see him as a coward who had failed his brother. They saw him as Jack had seen him, as someone worth saving, worth protecting, worth dying for. But the real test of Tommy's courage would come when he had to choose between hiding from his guilt and embracing the responsibility Jack had left him. 6 months after returning from Gallipoli, Tommy received a letter that would change everything. It was from Lieutenant Harrison, Jack's former officer, who had survived the war and was now working to establish a fund for the widows and orphans of fallen soldiers. "I need men who understand what sacrifice means," Harrison wrote. "Men who knew heroes not as legends but as brothers, husbands, fathers. Your brother Jack was the finest soldier I ever served with. Not because he was fearless, but because he was afraid and did his duty anyway. I think you understand that better than most." Harrison was asking Tommy to help him tell the stories of the men who had died, to make sure their families received the support they needed, to ensure that their sacrifices weren't forgotten. It was exactly the kind of work Jack would have done if he had survived. Tommy's first instinct was to refuse. How could he, a coward who had hidden in a shell crater while his brother died, presume to honor the memory of heroes? But then he thought about Jack's letter, about Sarah and the baby who would be born in 3 months. About the other widows and orphans who needed someone to fight for them. Tommy's decision would prove that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not dying for something you believe in, but living for it. Tommy accepted Harrison's offer and spent the next 40 years working to support the families of fallen soldiers. He helped establish the first veterans assistance programs, fought for better pensions for war widows, and made sure that the children of dead heroes knew their fathers' stories. He married Sarah in 1918, not out of obligation to Jack's memory, but because they had found love in their shared grief and determination to honor the man they had both lost. They raised Jack's son, named John after his father, as their own, along with 3 more children who grew up knowing their Uncle Jack as a hero who had died to protect the people he loved. Every ANZAC Day, Tommy would stand at the memorial in Sydney, not as a survivor haunted by guilt, but as a man who had learned that courage comes in many forms. He would think about Jack's letter, about the choice his brother had made to save him, about the responsibility that came with being the one who lived. Tommy never stopped missing Jack, never stopped wishing his brother had come home. But he learned to carry that grief as Jack had carried his rifle, as a tool for protecting others, for building something better from the ashes of loss. In 1965, 50 years after Gallipoli, Tommy McLeod was awarded the Order of Australia for his work with veterans' families. In his acceptance speech, he said something that would be remembered long after he was gone. "My brother Jack died a hero's death at Gallipoli, saving 12 men, including me. For years, I thought surviving made me a coward. But I learned that Jack didn't save my life so I could waste it on guilt. He saved it so I could live it. For him, for the men who didn't come home, and for the families they left behind." Tommy McLeod lived to be 89 years old, long enough to see his great-grandchildren and to know that Jack's sacrifice had created not just one life saved, but generations of lives lived with purpose and meaning. He died peacefully in 1986, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his work. On his gravestone, next to the words "beloved husband, father, and grandfather," is an inscription that captures the essence of his life. He lived for those who could not. The guilt of surviving when heroes die is a weight few can bear. but Tommy McLeod learned that the real tribute to the dead is not to join them in the grave, but to make their sacrifice meaningful by living a life worthy of their gift. Jack McLeod died so his brother could live. Tommy McLeod lived so his brother's death would matter. And in the end, that made them both heroes.